It's been labelled the comic that ruined comics, but after nearly 20 years, was Identity Crisis really that bad? Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Brad Meltzer and illustrated by Rags Morales, the first issue of Identity Crisis was published by DC Comics in June of 2004, with the 7th and final issue being released in December of the same year. And someone is targeting the family of the Justice League. With the true identities compromised, they'll be forced into a game of cat and mouse that they need to solve before more of their loved ones are killed. But what if the killer is closer than they could ever imagine? And what if a secret is discovered that's big enough to destroy the Justice League? Jumping into the art section now, and there was a lot that I respected about Rags Morales' style. It was crisp, detailed, atmospheric, but at the same time it had this cinematic quality to it. But considering this was a pre-Infinite Crisis event, it did a good enough job of bringing all these characters together and having that big scale feel to the page. However, in saying that, there was a lot of things about the art that I just didn't enjoy, and a lack of consistency throughout. From the very first issue, there's characters that have just got inexplicably tiny heads, weird positionings that look twisted in such a way that the human body wouldn't be able to do, and clear examples of panels just being copied from the one before. Like, yeah, we know these type of things happen in the industry, we've seen people make fun of it in the past, but not even being able to pull out all the stops for your first issue, it's kinda weak. As well, this dude just straight up could not draw eyes. I know this might sound like the nitpickiest of nitpicks, but it happened in every single issue. They were drawn way too big for the face that they were on, and as soon as I noticed it, I just couldn't unsee it. As well, in some of the bigger group moments, the pupils just weren't looking in the right direction. And I get that if you've never read this book before, it might sound super trivial, but there are scenes within Identity Crisis that force you to look into a character's eyes. So why not get an artist on board that can do it right? And honestly, they should have just called this Density Crisis, because it would have been far better if it didn't have an eye in it. However, credit where it's due, the pacing which is done through the paneling and also the tension that it managed to build was always done really well. This isn't one of those action-packed books, so those scenes where it is trying to build up the suspense and make you wonder what's going to happen always seem to know exactly how much of the issue needed to be dedicated towards it without it ever feeling like it was being rushed, or worse, they ever overstayed its welcome. Especially the scene in issue 5 when Robin's rushing to get back home. This felt textbook, and it did every trick that it needed to feel as suspenseful as possible, and the way that the art contributes to the pacing and the flow of the story really shouldn't be overlooked. Also, apart from the eyes, which we can't forget about because, well, they've been following me everywhere. The way that expressions were used really helped to sell the story. Obviously, Ralph finding Sue's body is the one that sticks with me the most, but for a story that's so emotionally driven, it was just key that Morales got that correct, and I'm glad that he did. It is just a shame that a few bad, repetitive elements could overshadow the rest of the work that was done on Identity Crisis. I know they did an Absolute Edition a few years back, and there are some things that I would like to see in a larger format, but for the most part, I don't think you're going to be disadvantaged if you don't hunt that version down, especially when you compare it to something like the Absolute 3 Jokers that was just released, because that is something that I feel like you need to see in oversize, especially when you realise that you can pick it up for a bit cheaper with the discount codes that we've got with the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below, and you can use these codes as many times as you like. We're jumping into the story section now, and there's a lot to unpack with this one. And also, I know this is a polarizing book. Some love it, some hate it, so there's already a 50% chance that you might not like this video, because honestly, I can't say that I was a fan of Identity Crisis. The worst part about it is that I found myself getting into the rhythm with it the longer it went on, but then the ending completely derailed the entire experience. I'm not jumping into spoilers just yet, so you're safe, but when it comes to a murder mystery, the ending is very much make or break. But let's backtrack a little bit, because it's not all bad, and there's still a lot that Identity Crisis did right. I've never read one of Brad Meltzer's novels before, but it's clear that he's got a knack for storytelling. The plot felt very methodic, and that he knew the right moment to sprinkle in some exposition, or just when a scene needed a little bit longer to get a desired effect. And it's really impressive how well he manages to do all that, and it's kind of integral because this isn't the usual action-packed series that you'd expect to see the Justice League in. Despite my thoughts on the ending, I did get roped into the mystery, and I would have had a far more negative impression of this book if I didn't. So I do have to respect Meltzer for being able to tell an engaging story that had me asking the big questions along with the other characters, such as who's going to be targeted next and who's behind it all. As well, with this being more grounded and smaller in scale in comparison to something like Crisis on Infinite Earths, and the killer going after the family of the heroes rather than the heroes themselves, it did feel like there were real stakes. And it's also ironic considering that Infinite Crisis followed this, a book that pretty much literally changed everything. But when looking at the majority of other company-wide events, they are often quite wishy-washy, there's not really a lot of consequence, and they promise an impact that they rarely deliver on. And depending on which way you look at Identity Crisis, you very well might think that it succeeds in that, or that it fails catastrophically. And it makes you follow characters that often don't get a lot of the spotlight. Like, you might not know a lot about the elongated man, but this story turned his life upside down. And it is easy to empathise with him because he was stretched further than he ever thought he could go. Yeah, that was a pretty bad joke, I'm sorry. You know what, to make it up for you, I'm gonna do you solid. If you're in the EU and you want free shipping and free gifts with every order, my personal recommendation would be Comics Bugle. And because that joke was so bad, I'm gonna do you another solid. If you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get 3% off all items that aren't already in a sale. That's just my way of apologising. But because of that grounded approach, there were some real oh shit moments in this book. Such as when Lois gets that anonymous letter confirming that somebody knows that Superman is her husband. Had I been reading this as it was coming out, I probably would have been worried for it. Although, and yeah, this is kind of spoilers, it's just very disappointing that that moment really amounted to nothing. And if I'm being honest, on reflection, it felt like a deleted scene that they forgot to get rid of. I guess so that's one of my biggest problems with Identity Crisis, that there's a ton of these moments that have a ton of promise, but very little to no payoff. There's another one that I can't get too deep with until we get into the spoiler section, but there's a secret that's revealed around the Justice League's past. There's a massive revelation that directly impacts one of its key members, but Meltzer just decides to never give us a moment where they find out. And it only seems to have a payoff in Infinite Crisis, so it's really lucky that I read that a few weeks ago. And yeah, at first I convinced myself that it's okay because it did give Infinite Crisis this good runway that you could tell an interesting story with. But then I told myself, no, I refuse to let Meltzer take credit for what someone else did with the mess that he created. Another problem that I had was with the narration itself. It almost felt like Meltzer treated this as if it was one of his own books, and he assumed that everybody reading wouldn't have a clue who any of the characters are or who they're connected with. Prime example, Starfire visits Dick Grayson, there's a caption box that says that they're former lovers, and then literally 2 panels later, Starfire has dialogue that says the same thing. So who was the narration for? Did they think somebody would panic and throw the book away if someone had to go 2 panels without knowing that? He even does it in issue 4, telling us that Ollie and Hal are best friends. Although I did like the little nod that Green Lantern Rebirth was coming. To give it credit though, the narration did help to hammer home the key theme of the book, in that family and the connections that you make along the way are as important, if not more, than the ones that you're born into. I just wish that it wasn't so on the nose about it, because I feel it also really hammered in the point that it's the ones closest to you that can hurt you the most. But it's so clear that that's the point they wanted to get across that I wish he would have been more nuanced about it, especially with his background in writing. But where he did seem to excel, and I touched on it earlier, is the scenes where there doesn't need to be as many words. And I know that kind of sounds like a backhanded compliment if your job is a writer. Anything where tension needed to be built, he kept the dialogue to a minimum and he didn't have narration flooding the page. It was sharper and it felt more like a TV show or movie, and I really can't fault the way that this book delivers on those types of scenes. The obvious example of that is in issue 5 when Batman and Robin are rushing to get back to Jack Drake. They team this up well with a great reveal that I wish would have had more weight on the overall story, so that it would have felt like everything was coming together, and this was one of those scenes where my head started to play music. And for as much as I'm saying that this isn't an action-packed book, there was still a great tactical fight with Deathstroke. It wasn't at a pace that you'd probably expect. Again, there was a ton of narration, but it worked in its favour because it gave a reason behind every move, and in all honesty, this was probably the highlight of this book for me. So by now, I think I've given enough positive points to show that I'm not just going to be hating on this book, which means it's time to look at what really went wrong here. Because honestly, this is the dumbest book that I've read that's just pretending to be smart. And if there is one thing I know about, it's being dumb, so there's no fooling me when it comes to this department. Let's start with the one that I mentioned in the beginning, that a mystery can only be as good as its ending. And if you're the type of person who likes to look for clues and try to piece things together before you get to that big reveal, just don't bother. The culprit is the most nonsensical pick, and they only did it so that they could have a twist for the sake of it. Pretty much every red herring, and even the fake out that they did before the big reveal, made more sense and had more evidence for it than the person who ended up being responsible. Honestly, it felt like even Meltzer didn't know who it's supposed to be until the final issue, and then he just picked the last person that he could think of. Even Batman apparently couldn't figure it out. And I think the biggest problem with Identity Crisis is that he just never seemed to know where to stop. So in just these 7 issues, there's at least 4 more people that it makes you think could be the killer. Every time one of the heroes does a bad thing, there's an even worse thing that's waiting in the next page, and it just goes way too far when it comes to Sue. Fair warning, I'm going to be talking about a scene that involves the R word, so if that's something that triggers you, you might want to skip this bit, but I have to talk about it because I feel like it puts such a cloud over this entire series. I get that they needed a catalyst to force the League to alter Dr. Light's mind and personality, but you're trying to tell me that this is the only way that you could have gone about it. And I said it a few years ago in my Joker review that I don't think R is completely off limits and it should never be written about, but it's a subject matter that you have to handle with a lot of tact, and Identity Crisis didn't. Because the thing is, art is always going to be a shocking thing despite it being tough subject matter. It's an easy way to make a scene shocking, and I'm just very disappointed that Brad Meltzer threw it in here and then didn't really do anything else with it. It's one of the worst things he could do, but are you telling me that's the only thing he could have done to prompt this situation? And it felt like they added this in just to look more mature than it actually was, because they didn't handle this well at all. There was no sincerity and it was basically just a plot point. And if you're like me, and because it happened so early on in the book, you might give it the benefit of the doubt and think it's going to lead to something else, but in the grand scheme of things, it's just a catalyst, as if Sue Dibney didn't go through enough in this book already. The only sort of saving grace with this is how it connected to the history of DC, and that is the weakest of silver linings for this situation. And I did actually kind of like how they also referenced that this isn't the first time that the League's had to do something like this, and connected it to those wacky Silver Age stories where the heroes have to switch bodies with the villains. And that context is pretty necessary, because without it, we've mostly just got a book where everyone is the worst person ever. The Sub-League with Zatanna, Hawkman, Atom, and the others that were involved in the Dr. Light decision felt more manipulating, conniving, and evil than some of the villains in this book. And who knows, perhaps that was Meltzer's intention, to show that there was this grey area between heroes and villains. And I'm all for that type of divide. If you watch my last review, you know I'm a massive Civil War apologist. The Marvel event before any history buffs come after me. But Identity Crisis never gave me that sense that the characters that were involved in those decisions ever took any of those actions for any reason other than satisfying their own agenda. When it comes to altering a villain's mind, yeah, sure, I can get behind that. Why not alter the dress sense whilst you're there? But the other stuff that the Sub-League does, I'm not on board with it. But I've beaten around the bush enough, and I think I've got across my main points without ripping into this book for a full couple of hours. So let's really jump into that ending. This is your final spoiler warning, so if you don't want anything else ruined, make sure you skip to the final verdict. But I can say your name now, so I'm going to ask this question again, but how could anybody predict that it was Jean? This was one of those twists where immediately I went, whoa, I couldn't see that coming, but then a few seconds later, I was like, wait, I couldn't see that coming. I'm all for a book making me feel stupid. In all honesty, if they use a word that's got more than 6 letters, it's probably going to stump me for a little bit, but this reveal just didn't have that effect. I didn't feel stupid because there was no way that I was ever going to figure this out. And then I was just annoyed that the end of this book was something that was going for shock value rather than something that made sense. And I said it in the spoiler-free section, but every red herring made more sense than Jean did. I would have been less annoyed if it turned out to be Ray. And that's probably what annoyed me the most, that pretty much just before this big reveal, we got a fake out that would have made more sense than the actual ending that we got. Both of them even had the same motivation if they were going to be the killers, so they pretty much just changed the character's name. For my money as well, they didn't even need a last issue twist, because there was already the revelation that the League had voted to wipe Batman's memory, and that was even more shocking than Jean's reveal. They could have just kept it as Captain Boomerang like we thought at the end of issue 5, and then had the Batman thing be the real gut punch, but despite the fact that the setup was there for them to use, Brad Meltzer completely fumbled it. Because there is no scene in Identity Crisis where Batman discovers what the League did to him, which is one of the most pivotal scenes in this book, and we just never got it. They could have even used that to the killer's advantage, have it be some kind of distraction technique, but no, and the Batman stuff pretty much goes completely overshadowed for the stupid Jean revelation. As well, why did Jean immediately turn insane? And that's not me being hyperbolic, she is literally taken to Arkham Asylum 5 minutes after she confesses. Throughout the rest of this book, she had it all put together, she was a little bit scared here and there, but she was still a lawyer and she had all the faculties about her. But no, she confesses to Atom and then just immediately turns into the Joker. Then again, I don't know if I can be too harsh on this, because that's kind of how I felt after I read this book. This is my final verdict. And words like polarizing and controversial are thrown about so often now that they've both kind of lost the meaning. But when it comes to Identity Crisis, there's no other way that I can think to describe it. Regardless of the outcome, Brad Meltzer dared to try and take the Justice League down a bold and dark direction with absolutely no fear of the consequences. And in a way, that is admirable. But the final product will always be more important than the intention behind it. This book, it is a bit of a mess, whether it be from the clunky writing, the baffling conclusion to the mystery, edgy decisions that were solely made for shock value, or whatever the hell kind of problem Rags Morales had when drawing eyes. And honestly, I couldn't make my mind up on this book until I got to the end. Which is a shame, because within these 7 issues, there is a mature tone that tries to push DC's most famous characters in a direction they often doesn't get to go down, disregarding the flashy action moments for tense conversations, shocking revelations that have lasting ramifications. I promise that was an accidental rhyme. So whether or not you'll enjoy Identity Crisis depends on how you adapt to that change, along with how much setup you might need for a twist to feel authentic, or how much liberty they can take with characters that you might already love. And I can see why this received backlash, but I also don't think this is the worst comic that DC's ever created. That title, it's still held safely by Rise of Arsenal issue 3. And after reading this, I have found myself wondering that despite my criticisms, maybe Identity Crisis has been remembered too harshly. It's not a bad book, it just does a lot that I don't like. Like, sometimes creators take the characters that we like in a direction that we don't want to see. Like, I still can't get over the fact that in the last Superman movie, I had to watch Jonathan Kent die of tornado. So sometimes we just have to accept that people are going to write characters in different ways, and I think that's the situation here with Identity Crisis. With that being said though, can I still recommend it? I think unless you're planning on doing a full read through where you go with this and then Infinite Crisis and then 52, you're probably better off just reading something else. Unless of course you're looking for a book that shows you the worst side of some of your favourite characters. And if I had to sum up Identity Crisis in one sentence, you don't have to rush to read this one, but if you wanted a murder mystery with the Justice League, it's probably one of your best bets. But that's a review, and hopefully you enjoyed it, and until next time, just make sure that you stay safe, and stay mad all you dogs. Woof woof! See you at the next video.